Gaylor Charlie. Today I've got a story for you that feels less like a battle report and more like a warning carved into the sea. And if you enjoy high-stakes military narration like this, subscribe to Gaylor Charlie now, because the next story will go even deeper. By day 4, Iran's naval power wasn't damaged. It was erased. 17 ships gone, not limping back to port, not partially disabled, sunk. And by day 11, the number had climbed to 51. A count so extreme it stops sounding like modern warfare and starts sounding like history class, the kind of number people associate with wars from another era. Except this wasn't black and white footage. In this fictional scenario, it happened at full speed, under satellites, sensors, and weapons that don't miss twice. But among all the losses, among all the steel that went under, one moment became the symbol of the entire operation. The sinking of the Iris Shahed Bagheri, Iran's pride, a giant, a floating statement. It wasn't born as a warship. It was converted, rebuilt from an old container ship into a massive offshore base, 240 meters long, a displacement of roughly 42,000 tons. In sheer size, it stood in the same weight class as a World War II American carrier, huge, imposing, and impossible to ignore. Iran's plan was simple in concept and terrifying in consequence. Use this ship as a platform for overseas drone attacks, a roaming launch pad that could push threat far beyond coastal waters. But here's the problem with turning a commercial hull into a military icon. Size can make you powerful, or it can make you easy to find. Because in a modern fight, if you don't have layered armor, real damage control depth, advanced air defenses, if you don't have the systems that let a warship survive the first punch, then all that size becomes is a bigger, slower target. And in this story, the United States treated it exactly like that. A target, a mission, a demonstration. Off the coast near Bandar Abbas, the Shahed Bagheri was turned into something no Navy ever wants its flagship to become. A burning landmark, leaked civilian recordings, and satellite-based heat signatures. In this fictional telling, suggested the night horizon didn't glow like a normal fire. This wasn't a deck blaze or a fuel accident. This was detonation after detonation. Controlled violence engineered by precision. 2,000-pound GBU-31 JDAMs, bunker-busting class weapons, came down from F-35C jets at angles that made steel behave like thin cardboard. One bomb didn't just hit the ship. It punched through into the center mass, the way a spear finds the heart. And once the weapon reached the interior, the physics took over. A high-pressure shock wave, a brutal bloom of force, compartments turning into blast chambers. Then the chain reaction, the nightmare sequence every naval officer fears most. Internal stores cooking off, secondary explosions, ammunition igniting not as a single event, but as a cascade. It didn't look like a ship dying. It looked like a ship being unmade. And when the Shahed Bagheri finally sank, still burning, still shedding fire and smoke as it slipped under, its descent became, in this movie scene world, the largest military ship loss of its kind since World War II. But the strategic wound wasn't only emotional, it wasn't only symbolic, it was mathematical. Because inside this broader destruction was a detail that didn't just matter to Iran, it mattered to the entire planet. 16 mine-laying vessels were destroyed. 16. And these weren't ceremonial boats or coastal toys. They were loaded with Sadaf 02 type mines, built for one mission and one mission only. Close the Strait of Hormuz, the choke point, the artery, a narrow corridor that carries the bloodstream of the global economy. Now pause and let the counterfactual breathe, because this is where the story stops being about ships and becomes about consequences. Imagine those mine layers had survived. Imagine they had slipped out under cover of confusion and dumped their mines where they were meant to go. Roughly 21 million barrels of oil per day pass through that strait. In a world this interconnected, you don't need a global war to trigger global panic. You only need a blocked passage. Oil prices could spike beyond $150 in a heartbeat. Fuel prices could surge overnight. Markets could convulse. Shipping insurers could freeze coverage. Nations that don't even border the Gulf could feel the shock. That is what asymmetry looks like. Not beating an enemy fleet ship for ship, but threatening the flow that keeps everyone alive. And in this fictional operation, the mine layers didn't get their chance. They were removed before the threat could become reality. While the surface fleet burned and sank, something else happened, something quieter, colder, and in some ways more terrifying. Because down below, beyond sight, beyond the last glimmer of firelight on the water, a different kind of killing took place. On March 4, 2026, in the southern waters near Sri Lanka, the Iranian Navy's Moj-class frigate Iris Dana was detected by an American submarine on patrol. By American standards, it wasn't a monster. Around 1,500 tons, closer in size and punch to a heavily armed patrol craft than a true blue water heavyweight. But it was a commissioned warship, a flag, a crew, a chain of command floating on the assumption that the sea still offered space to operate. Then a torpedo entered the equation. And here's where the story shifts from drama to engineering, because what happened next wasn't luck, and it wasn't chaos. It was design. The weapon, a Mark 48 torpedo. People often imagine torpedoes like underwater missiles, slam into the side, explode, and tear a hole. But the Mark 48's genius is uglier than that. It doesn't have to smash into armor. It hunts the ship's acoustic and magnetic signature and drives itself beneath the keel. Because the keel is the spine. And if you break the spine, the body doesn't fight. When the warhead, around 650 pounds of high explosive, detonates under the keel, it creates a massive, superheated gas bubble. Water doesn't compress easily, so the pressure becomes a weapon in itself. The bubble expands violently, lifting the ship upward, then collapses, creating a sudden void, and the ship drops into nothing for a fraction of a second. That is enough. The keel snaps under the ship's own weight. Not a leak. Not a list. Not abandoned ship. A structural failure so fast, the crew barely has time to understand what's happening. In this scene, the Iris Dana split in two and sank within seconds, becoming a demonstration of something modern navies live with every day. You don't have to see the threat that kills you. And when word of these sinkings spread, ship after ship, airstrikes above, torpedoes below, it didn't just damage Iran's fleet. It attacked the psychology of command. Because once sailors believe the sea is no longer a maneuver space, once they believe every sortie becomes a funeral, the chain of obedience begins to crack. A navy can survive losses. What it can't survive is the certainty of annihilation. That's what technological asymmetry does. It turns platforms worth millions into debris with a single well-placed weapon. It makes training, pride, and tradition irrelevant in the face of systems that don't negotiate. And then, as if to underline the point, another key strike landed on March 3, 2026, a day earlier, but a chapter that deepened the dread. The Kilo-class submarine Iris Fateh, described in this fictional script as a strategic asset, was detected near Bandar Abbas and sunk. Unlike America's nuclear-powered hunter-killer submarines, fast, long-range, designed to stay submerged for extended periods, this was a diesel-electric platform with limits. Older generation, smaller, slower, and crucially, it needed to surface or snorkel to recharge batteries. That necessity is a weakness you can set your clock to. In this scenario, open-source flight trackers picked up P-8 Poseidons, departing from Diego Garcia, flying patterns that looked abnormal. Wide circles, patient loops, the geometry of a search. A cat-and-mouse game, except the cat had technology and the mouse had a clock ticking on its oxygen and power. The P-8s seeded the ocean with sonobuoys, listening nets that turn the sea into a field of ears. Acoustic signatures don't lie forever. Propeller cavitation, machinery hum, transient noises. Eventually, something speaks. And once the submarine was boxed in, Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes entered the water. A submarine's pressure hull is sacred. It's the one line between a crew and crushing depth. When that hull fails, there's no slow sinking, no graceful retreat. There is only silence. The sinking of the Iris Fateh, operating around the Strait of Hormuz, wasn't just a tactical victory in this story, it was a message. Even the invisible pieces of the asymmetric threat could be found, hunted, ended, and after that, the Iranian naval forces, realizing they could not operate in open waters, attempted refuge among civilian ports and commercial traffic. But hiding in clutter isn't immunity. Sometimes it only delays the inevitable. The waters near Bandar Elenge and nearby coastal areas became temporary shelters for missile corvettes like Haj Qasem and Iris Shahed Sayed Shirazi in this script. The logic was desperate, but understandable. If you anchor close to civilian infrastructure, maybe your enemy hesitates, but modern targeting doesn't always require visual confirmation. Coordinates can come from patterns, commercial traffic metadata, signals, movement history, and in this narrative, missiles shattered military platforms even as they sat near port zones. Secondary explosions explosions, violent, unmistakable, suggested additional small craft, including Revolutionary Guard patrol boats, were also caught in the strike net while attempting to blend into the backdrop of cargo vessels. And here comes one of the most chilling conclusions of the whole scenario. When ships sail, they're hunted by torpedoes. When they stay in port, they're hunted by missiles. The idea of a safe zone, the psychological cornerstone of military cohesion, evaporates. And when that happens, discipline becomes fragile. Orders become questions. Missions become arguments. Because if every option ends with a burning hull, then courage isn't the only thing that breaks. The institution breaks. And civilians, looking out from coastal cities as the night sky flashes with blasts, don't just witness military losses. They witness the cracking of the state's invincibility narrative. That is how a navy's collapse becomes a regime's problem. Because Iran's heaviest diplomatic weapon, its leverage in global politics, was never only missiles or drones. It was the threat of disruption, the threat to strangle oil traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. But in this story, a state with a wiped-out navy no longer has the physical tool to carry out that threat. Without ships and submarines that can operate, the doctrine becomes theater. Meanwhile, the American fleet, securing trade routes, turns the Gulf into something like an operational lake. Controlled lanes, layered surveillance, dominance that forces the opponent into reactive hiding. And when logistical lines are severed, the damage compounds. Oil revenue is a lifeline. Coastal defense is a necessity. Maritime borders aren't theoretical. They're where economics, sovereignty, and security intersect. So when the platforms sink, it's not just metal that disappears. It's influence, it's reach, it's bargaining power, it's strategic depth. In this narrative, the political tone hardened as well. On March 10, 2026, the U.S. president, named in the script as Donald Trump, issued an ultimatum framed not as routine rhetoric, but as something closer to doctrine, that any interference with oil flow would be punished 20 times harder, and that death, fire, and fury would follow. Language implying not only strikes on military assets, but the possibility of targeting the foundations that keep a state functioning. The script then escalates the idea further with the notion of eliminating targets so completely that reconstruction becomes impossible, words that, in this fictional world, signal strategic strangulation rather than limited retaliation. Statements attributed in the script to defense leadership, naming Pete Hegseth and Admiral Brad Cooper, push the same theme: overwhelming force, decisive continuation, striking anything that can fire back, abandoning proportional habits in favor of full-spectrum suppression. And then the ripple effect travels farther than the Gulf, because the operation's meaning doesn't stop at Iran. In the story, it lands like a cold shock in Beijing. Iran's systems, radars, anti-ship missiles, and parts of its naval concept are described as heavily influenced by Chinese defense design, whether by product, partnership, or imitation. So if those tools collapse in less than 2 weeks against American air power, electronic warfare, and undersea dominance, then Chinese planners watching the data don't just see Iran losing ships. They see a mirror, a live simulation of what could happen to their own assumptions under American pressure. And if the doctrines behind A2AD, denial strategies meant to keep U.S. forces at bay, look fragile when tested, then the intimidation value of those doctrines begins to dissolve. That's why, in this narrative, the Persian Gulf becomes more than a battlefield. It becomes an advertisement for technological hierarchy, a demonstration that authoritarian regimes can build impressive-looking arsenals and still discover, too late, that deterrence is not about owning weapons. It's about whether your weapons can survive contact with the enemy's system of systems. By the end of the script, Iran's loss of maritime control on its own shores reduces its strategic depth to nearly zero. A force that can't safely leave port can't project power. A navy pinned to the coastline becomes a trapped asset, a fleet in name only, and the Gulf, once an arena of harassment, leverage, and threat, becomes, in the words of this story, an open-air prison and a museum of wrecks. Not just sunken hulls, sunken doctrine, sunken blackmail capability. So March 10th, 2026 becomes the symbolic closing page, the end of an era of asymmetric maritime threats in the Persian Gulf, and the beginning of a new equation, one written in precision strikes, underwater kill mechanics, and the psychological collapse of anyone forced to operate under total surveillance. 51 wrecks at the bottom of the sea, a massive converted flagship turned into an inferno, a modern frigate split apart by a single torpedo strike, and a navy's mobility, its ability to move, threaten, and maneuver, stopped like a heart that can't beat anymore. Because when the sea is no longer yours, land power starts to wobble too. The ocean isn't just water, it's trade, it's oxygen, it's leverage. And when that leverage sinks, what's left floating is the question every strategist dreads. What happens next? Now, I want to hear from you, and I'm going to ask 2 questions only, because I want this comment section focused and intense. If those 16 mine layers had succeeded in mining the Strait of Hormuz in this scenario, do you think the world response would have escalated into something much larger, or would it have forced a rushed negotiation? What do you think matters more in modern naval dominance? Air power that can erase ships in minutes, or undersea warfare that can kill without being seen? Drop your answers in the comments. Seriously, I read them, and your perspective shapes what I cover next. And if you want more narrations like this, tight, cinematic, and built for deep analysis, subscribe to Gaylor Charlie and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next upload.